Hello and welcome to On Point. I'm Emily Davies. Immigration reform has been a widely debated topic, particularly when it comes to those who enter and live in the United States without documents. The Department of Homeland Security estimates a population of 11 million immigrants living and working here illegally. California residents are no strangers to this issue. The Department of Homeland Security's 2010 report found states to have the highest population of undocumented immigrants in the nation, with about 2.5 million. States have attempted to create their own reform plans, but have run into some ethical and legal controversies. President Obama decided to make the issue one of his top priorities in the final term. In his State of the Union address, Obama says real reform means stronger border security, putting more boots on the southern border than at any time in our history, and reducing illegal crossings to their lowest levels in 40 years. He adds that real reform means establishing a responsible pathway to earn citizenship, including passing a background check, paying taxes and a meaningful penalty, learning English, and going to the back of the line behind the folks trying to come here legally. However, his plans have been repeatedly rejected by lawmakers. The main conflicting issues between the president and Congress are border enforcement, a path to becoming a citizen, and family reunification. Recently, a bipartisan group of 8 senators presented an overhaul of current immigration laws that included a path to citizenship. Under the bill, immigrants would be required to file with Homeland Security, pay income tax for time lived here, maintain a clean legal record, and forego any federal benefits. This would give them probationary legal status and put them on a waiting list for full citizenship. We spoke with media director of the nonprofit Federation for American Immigration Reform, Ira Melman, over the phone about immigration reform in general. He says FAIR believes immigration policy should focus on American citizens first.
When you talk about immigration reform, it ought to begin from the premise that the American public is the primary constituency for immigration policy, and we ought to implement laws in a way that best carry out those interests of the American people. We need to recognize the impact that it has on jobs in this country, on people seeking higher wages in this country, on the tax dollars that people have to pay to provide services to people once they come to the United States, the impact that it has on vital social institutions like schools and healthcare facilities. Those are the sorts of things that we believe need to be looked at.
The DREAM Act is one proposed legislation meant to help with the undocumented immigration issue. It would put all undocumented children who came here before the age of 16 on a pathway to citizenship. On Point reporter Tommy Fuller spoke with one hopeful student looking to benefit from the DREAM Act. Maribel Serrano has gained national attention for her documentary Drill, standing for Dreams Are Real, where she recounts her experiences growing up in America as an undocumented immigrant from Mexico.
My parents brought me to the U.S. when I was 4 years old, so at that point I don't know what a country is, I don't know what immigration is, none of that. So I just grew up here, American, normal, feeling, just living a normal life. But when I really found out was when I tried to get my first job, and I realized that I couldn't because I didn't have the proper documentation, and all my peers, my friends, they were all getting jobs, and I just felt really left out.
Serrano says although Mexico is her heritage, America is her home.
If you're born to your mom, she gave you birth, but then when you were 4 years old, you have a different mom and she raised you for 21 years, obviously that's who you feel is your mom. That's who educated you, that's who made you who you are. So I feel like a connection with Mexico, and I'm proud of having Mexican roots, but I feel like completely American. I've been raised here all my life.
Though getting things like a job and financial aid for her schooling has been difficult, she says she's managed to find work, buy a brand new car, and will be graduating from CSUN in the near future. We asked Melman about FAIR's position on the DREAM Act, and he says although they understand there are some people like Serrano who did not choose to come to this country illegally, granting amnesty will send the wrong message to foreign parents.
If you send a signal around the world that if you get your children to the United States, however you get them here, if you can keep them here for a few years and they complete high school, that they will be rewarded with a green card, essentially what you're doing is encouraging more people to violate the law. And again, this comes at the expense of opportunities for other people. The DREAM Act includes access to in-state tuition in state universities at a time when many families in this country are struggling to get their own kids through college. It shifts the onus for having broken the law from the people who broke it, namely the parents, to the American people. And we understand that very often there are innocent children who are kind of caught in the middle here. But ultimately, it is the responsibility of the parents, not American society. But we don't have to choose between mass capitulation in the form of amnesty or mass deportations, which nobody seriously is suggesting anyway.
Now I'll hand the discussion over to On Point's Amber Canyon for more on the story.
Thank you, Emily. Today we have with us Professor of Economics at Cal State Northridge, Shirley Svorny, and Cal State Northridge Chicano Studies Professor, Martha Escobar. Thank you for being with us today, ladies.
No, thank you.
So I'm just going to jump into this by starting off with the obvious. It's President Obama's second term, and there's been a lot of talk about immigration reform, and people are really starting to feel like there may be some progress on this issue. So my first question is for you, Shirley. What are the economic implications of Obama's planned path to citizenship?
Well, kind of the economics of immigration is fairly straightforward, that to the extent that people can come here and be more productive, it benefits them and it benefits the United States. So the issues are really just more the nature of the policies and whether they favor certain groups or whether they encourage illegal immigration. And so you really want to look at them individually and see how they, stand up against those kinds of issues.
So how many more workers do you think that our labor market can really absorb?
Actually, a labor market can absorb a lot more workers than you think. The classic example is when all women decided they wanted to work and they all entered the labor market and jobs are created. So having labor is a good thing for business and increases the gross domestic product. There's not a fixed number of jobs in any country.
So my other question too on that specific issue is people often say that undocumented immigrants, they work in this country, they do work that other Americans refuse to do. So do you think that's true?
Well, certainly to the extent that having the workers here makes it so that those jobs don't pay as much as American workers can earn elsewhere. But if those workers weren't here, the wages would be higher and some American workers would be willing to do them. So it's not the job so much as the wage. And these are jobs that it's nice to have low-cost labor. It benefits the workers and it benefits the people who buy the products. It doesn't make it, it's not that those jobs wouldn't be filled. You wouldn't have as many, the product prices would be higher.
So Martha, my next question is for you. Are undocumented workers often exploited in this country?
Yes, and not just undocumented workers. It's also, for example, guest workers, people that come in with visas that are brought in to H-2 visas specifically that are brought in to labor. And so what ends up happening is that in that situation, when they're guest workers, they can only work for that employer. You can't move to another job. If you move, you lose your visa and you become undocumented or you have to return home. And so what we've seen in those cases is that employers in some cases have confiscated their passports and their visas and pay them extremely low wages. So it's not just undocumented workers. The status of undocumented workers makes them vulnerable to exploitation. It makes it very difficult to move from one job to another if you don't have social security number, so on and so forth. So that does make them vulnerable, but it's not just undocumented workers.
So can I just kick
go
in
ahead.
here? So I was going to say that I certainly understand why it seems like they would, be in the situation where people could take advantage of them, but just without knowing too much about it, I would guess that it's not super prevalent in that if you want someone to work hard for you, it's not really treating them poorly isn't a good way to get them to work hard for you. And I would imagine that the employers have some kind of reputation at stake because in the future, people are going to have to come to work for them. And so I would be really surprised to find, people always take one or two stories, and maybe there are many. Maybe it's 20%, maybe it's 30%. I just don't imagine it's almost everybody because it just, the way I look at it just seems hard to believe that, that's the way to get someone to work for you is to treat them poorly and then to get someone to come back and work for you again. So I don't know what the percentage is, and you don't either, right?
No, not the exact percentage, but we have to think of, that's why in a capitalist society, we like having unemployment because that makes, if you don't want to work for me, I can get anybody else, right? There's for you one job, there's many applicants to come in and for lower wages. So that's what makes it vulnerable too. When you have so many people that are unemployed, you're more than likely
Right,
going to stay
certainly.
in that situation right? And that's why the United States, we rely on undocumented workers to come in and do that work for us because they serve that purpose. If a person who's a legal resident or a citizen has a job, right, and you're being mistreated or the working conditions are poor, you can always decide, you know what, I may leave and so on. That's fine. Go ahead and leave because there's these many more people,
Other people who are willing to come
especially
in.
undocumented, that are willing to come in and do that job. So, so it is, from what I've, not just studies, but family members, friends.
I'm sure there's cases. Do you know cases of people that are well treated?
No, yeah. And so in some cases,
I
yeah.
just want to make it not.
No,
it
it's
seems like
not.
people
It's
look
not
at it and they say,
one or the other.
All
But-
workers are poorly
but
treated. And I just doubt it.
structurally,
It is
what we
it
have
is
in
an issue.
place, yeah.
So, other than that, the issue of work, immigrants who do come to this country undocumented that make this journey, what is their typical experience other than the issues they have with work? Like a typical story,
varied.
I should say. Better way to say it.
No, it's so varied, right? It just depends. A lot of it has to do. Most people do desire work, right? That's many people. That's why they're here. So that becomes a big struggle to just be able to obtain a job, and what that entails. It depends on if you have connections, if you have family members, if they know people that will hire you. So a lot of it has to do with who, the social networks that are available to you. It can be your family, friends, or church, or, So a lot of it has to do with that. In terms of things are difficult. Think of, for example, housing, right? Sometimes the things that are asked for housing in terms of identification, so on and so forth. In some of these cases, they do need to resort to, for example, in some cases, purchasing a fake identification just to be able to get through little small things, renting a place or purchasing something on credit, or, So it depends what you're talking about specifically. A typical day, and then it's gendered as well, right? It's different experiences for women and men, for people who are elderly,
So would you say there's a different experience for, say, students? Because I know the DREAM Act is a very big issue as well, or topic.
And it depends on when they're brought to the United States, right? In terms of students, from what I've heard from the dreamers, from their stories, from their narratives, is that they grew up in the United States, many of them from a very young age, just as another youth in the United States. They don't really come to understand the meaning of being unauthorized in the United States until they get to the point where they want to drive, where they want to get a job, when they want to go to college. And so that's when it really hits many of them. Unless their family members are being affected, such as being deported, having their parents deported, then they're really dealing with it very earlier on, right? So it depends, but when it hits a lot of them is when they're having to engage in these legal transactions, right? That they realize they're very limited in what they can do.
So when listening to it, it seems like the DREAM Act would be the very compassionate path to take for the country. So what would you say to convince Americans who don't know, dreamers or really know the struggle, that the DREAM Act is the right thing for the country?
I'm very critical of the DREAM Act, actually, extremely critical, because the way that we're representing ourselves in terms of immigrant communities is trying to show ourselves as deserving of membership in the United States. We try to show that we pay taxes, that we don't engage in criminality, the dreamers, that they go to school, and so what that misses is the structural inequalities. That, for example, with Chicanos, we have an over 50% push-out rate in high schools. Most of us don't graduate, right? Many of those are dreamers as well, right? And so this narrative of we're deserving, we should be allowed to become members of society doesn't take into account what about the students that weren't able to make it, and not necessarily because they just didn't work hard, but because they didn't identify with the material, because they lacked support from their educational system. And so I'm very critical to push that narrative of deserving, and I'm more interested. Let's look at the structural issues, right? Let's look at the labor market. Let's look at our foreign policy and how our foreign policy shapes migration patterns. Free trade agreements that are meant theoretically to make living conditions in these other countries, for example, Mexico with the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994, that was theoretically meant to create better jobs in Mexico for Mexicans. And what we saw is over 1 million farm workers displaced from their homes and having to migrate just to be able to feed their families. So we have to think more critically of this larger picture that leads to migration. So I'm very critical of the DREAM Act and saying that this is a response. What I'm saying is let's take a seat back and actually understand the structural issues that lead people to not be able to be home. That should be a human right shift for me. You should be able to migrate to be able to sustain yourself, but you should also have the right to stay home and sustain your families. And how is it that our policies are not allowing for that?
Well, I know a lot of times the issue of the economy always comes up. So, Shirley, what would you say is the biggest cost to American society of immigration?
Well, immigration is a benefit. There can be costs if there are social programs, but most immigrants don't come here to take advantage of social programs. I want to get back and say one point about what you said about how a lot of kids who would be dreamers if we weren't, judging them, don't graduate high school. But if they knew they had the potential to work in the United States, I think you'd see a change in their behavior too. I mean, a lot of people don't work hard because in economics, we always talk about how it's the incentives that affect your behavior. And if you thought you had the opportunities that everybody else has in this country, you might change your behavior. You wouldn't have as many people dropping out. So from the economics point of view, to get back to your question, there's, immigration can benefit countries. In fact, it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next 20 years, because a lot of countries are getting, their populations are getting older and they have a lot of social programs, and they're going to need young workers. So some of these countries are paying people to have babies, but at some point they're going to turn to immigration as a way to get young people. I'm just not sure the United States we have the same problems that these other countries have in trying to sustain the social programs with a small cohort of young people.
So who would you say is really benefiting, and with that, who is hurting, if anyone, from undocumented immigration?
Well, the issue with undocumented immigration is that it's against the law. That's what people who are against it would say, that there's people who would like to come here. I think the way our immigration policy seems to be one where if you can sneak in, or if there's some political reason for you to come here, we let you come in, but we don't have what maybe economists would call a rational immigration policy that would encourage, people to come who really have the most to gain from coming to this country. And one kind of interesting proposal, two economists, Gary Becker and Ed Lazier, have suggested that we allow people to come to the United States freely, but charge them $50,000. And you could borrow the money and you'd pay it back. And their point is that that would be better than the kind of point system we have now and the illegal immigration, because people would only come if it was really valuable for them to be here. And they're kind of saying that would, whenever you have immigration, you're rationing it. And they're saying that's a better way to ration it than the political mechanism we've been using.
So in terms of, getting people to the country, I know that, Marta, you recently held a panel, and one of the speakers on the panel, it was about migration, and one of the speakers said something to suggest that some immigration reform advocates who, may not necessarily be for the undocumented immigration, that some of it may suggest some type of racism.
And in terms of the anti-immigration movement?
Yes.
Historically, that has been the case from the very foundation of the United States. Our first naturalization laws, for example, the 1790 naturalization law, which meant, who is allowed to naturalize as a U.S. citizen of people who migrated to the U.S. That very first law said, only white property-owning men were allowed to naturalize from the origins of the country, right? From that point on, our immigration to the United States has been a racialized history. Our immigration policy, the exclusion of Asians, for example, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 had everything to do with race. So from the very beginning, we've had that history. So racism has been institutionalized into our immigration policies. And we can't leave that behind.
So one nice thing about this thing where you'd pay 50 grand is that it wouldn't have a racial component at all.
But we have to realize that because of these histories of inequality, because of colonialism and the fact that the countries that are poorest in the world are poor because of that history of colonialism, and colonialism is rooted in racism, it still has that impact.
What is the implication for us?
Well, this is what I want to get at.
Okay.
I noticed that you're mentioning a lot of different history moments of like migration, and it seems like a lot of those have kind of changed over the years. So when you hear immigration reform groups like FAIR talk about the need to protect American people's rights and laws, does it really make sense since so much has changed from those times?
It depends. It depends what you're talking in terms of change, right? Yesterday, one of the speakers at the panel that you just mentioned, the panel was on understanding the relationship between the experiences of blacks in the United States and the experiences of Latino migrants today. One of the speakers, Professor Rhonda McGee from the University of San Francisco, she made a connection between slavery and the system and the labor market that we established in the United States of bringing in non-white bodies to produce wealth for a white nation, right? And she said that provided the model from which we now draw from. Once we no longer had the ability to enslave people, then we brought in other non-white bodies to produce that wealth, such as the Chinese, and then when we didn't desire them anymore because of racial ideas, we excluded them, and then we brought in Japanese, and when we didn't want them anymore because of these racial ideas, we excluded them, and then Mexicans as well, right? And so it's been a history where we have that relationship. Think about today in terms of
racism, or is it just that these people find opportunity in the United States? Like, were there white people who wanted to come that we didn't allow to come?
But again, it goes back to that history of colonialism, right? That the history of racism and colonialism in the globe. So that's why you have countries, for example, Africa looks the way that it does because
Right,
Europe
so
is the way that it does.
So your logic is they're poor because of us. And then what's the implication for our immigrant policy?
In terms of, exactly, right? Because our foreign policy continues that legacy. So for example, the North American Free Trade Agreement that we signed between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, right? That's inherently an unequal economic relationship between these countries. And so what's going to end up happening is that Mexico had a lot of migrants that were displaced because of that unequal relationship.
Whenever you open up trade, that happens.
So do you think there is an economic implication there?
Right. Whenever you open up trade, you always displace some people, and that's what trade means. It means you buy from the low-cost producer. So when you open up borders, you're going to have people who have to change what they do. And that's always common. I mean, there may have been other people in Mexico who did really well because their products were selling in the U.S. and in Canada. Usually it's not one-sided. It's usually better for a country to trade because if you don't trade, you tend to be poorer.
But it depends how you're trading, right? And in this case, we want free trade specifically for us to be able to, for example, export to Mexico corn that's subsidized in the United States that ended up displacing so many people in Mexico. But then when that displacement happens because of our policies, because of our economic and foreign policies, our response is, for example, to militarize the border so that when those bodies that are displaced need to find work and end up trying to find it across the border, they're stopped.
So I think it seems to me that your problem is with subsidies to agricultural crops, not the whole rest of the chain. Just if there were no subsidy, you'd be okay with that?
I'm sorry to interrupt, Louise, but listening to you guys, there's always different angles. There's always both, personally and politically, economically. There's so many different angles. So do you think that a compromise can ever be reached over the issue?
Yeah, I think so. What do you
It depends what we mean by compromise. And my perspective is that we need to take a step back and really understand structurally what leads to migration, including our economic policies, our foreign policies, how our response to immigration is racialized, how it's problematic. Take that larger picture, and then from that point, when you're well educated, when you've had that conversation, what do we do at that point? Because right now it comes down to numbers, and these are more than numbers. These are human beings.
Well, what would you like to do? Like, let's say everyone
Have
was
that conversation.
but let's say everyone knew everything that you know, right? Because you know all this and we don't. What would you then want to do?
After having that conversation, we'd need to start changing our foreign policies with countries.
So this is not just immigration. You'd want foreign policy.
Yeah, no, it's not just immigration.
Right.
It's not just immigration. It has to be
a bigger
because
issue.
Immigration is policy is economic policy, right? We have to look at it
It's certainly
from
a
that larger
component.
perspective.
Well, thank you so much, ladies, for being with us today.
Thank you, Amber.
Nice being with you.
Come on, let's go.
Just a minute, I gotta finish this.
Wait, you're gonna post those pictures of Mary?
Yep. She thinks she's so hot.
But her mom and dad will see them. Her grandmother, her little sister, everyone she knows, it's gonna kill her.
Who cares? Just a couple of pictures. It's no big deal.
No big deal? Don't. This has gotta stop.
The smallest moments can have the biggest impact on a child's life. Take time to be a dad today. Call or visit fatherhood.gov to learn more.
It's Timothy Green's first day at school.
What's in there? He's about to fall
anything
over.
he might need. There's a box of tissues on the bottom and some Band-Aids. There's a whole first aid kit, actually.
Mom, I can handle it from here.
You don't have to be perfect
Have a great day.
That's too much pressure.
Have the day you have.
to be a perfect parent.
There are two people in the world who want you more than anything. They'll make some mistakes, but they will love you more than you can ever imagine.
There are thousands of children in foster care who will take you just as you are.
My parents say I have to be home right after work.
That's so gay.
Totally gay.
That is so Emma and Julia. Imagine if who you are were used as an insult. When you say that's so gay, do you realize what you say? Knock it off.
We would like to thank you for watching On Point. You can follow us on Facebook by searching CSUN On Point and on Twitter at CSUN On Point, all one word. The show appears on our website at CSUNTVnews.com, and we air on television channel LA 36 Sundays at 4 o'clock. For Amber Canyon and all of us here at On Point, I'm Emily Davies. Thank you for watching.